courage or desperation would compel Dr. King to become involved in social reform, the way he did in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. At that time, it was Rosa Parks refusing to obey an unjust law. But in 2011, we saw many people resisting injustice all over the world. And in Tunisia, for example, city officials had repeatedly denied a young street vendor the opportunity, the right to sell produce in that city on the street. And in an act of desperation, he lit himself on fire in public. And this man's self-immolation is what touched off the Arab Spring across many countries. This kind of everyday injustice doesn't just happen overseas. Here in Delray Beach, city officials passed a community gardening ordinance last year, saying they wanted to create standards for gardens in the city. So far, I have only seen that ordinance used to block a landowner in a low-income neighborhood from building a garden that she started developing before the ordinance was passed. Whatever the particulars of the situation in general, I think there would be some form of the same old story of those with power, bullying the powerless, limiting their opportunities to fully express themselves, and curtailing their freedom and dignity. But it would take an act of courage or desperation to get King's attention to a local issue that was affecting his community, one that likely affected him personally, and probably would have national implications to boot.
Reverend?
With respect to the Montgomery bus boycott, I think it's true to say that he was somewhat reluctant to get involved, that he really wanted to be the pastor of his church and serve the people and serve Christ through that ministry. But then Rosa Parks came along, and as those of us who are ministers of the gospel often find, we get pushed into sometimes having to do what God wants us to do. We need that little shove. So I think it's important to note that too. I think he was, in some sense, and this is very biblical, the reluctant prophet. Once he felt the call, it was full steam forward. But in my Amos was the reluctant prophet. Jeremiah was a reluctant prophet. Isaiah was a reluctant prophet. In fact, beware the one who's not the reluctant prophet. I have to say that I really, in thinking about this question of what local injustice, I think Dr. King would be absolutely grieved at black-on-black crime. I think he would be grieved at the incarceration rates of young black men today. And I think that he would be challenging us all to ask what kind of structures are continued systemically to be in place that continue to plague us as a society that results in that. That also doesn't call forth from us a demand to know what we all need to do to be able to start working on this plague, because it turns out that it, in fact, is keeping a form of slavery in place.
Thank you. You know, King went from being a spokesperson for the anti-segregation movement to really being the whole architect of the civil rights movement. And that transition didn't happen overnight. It took 7 years. So when we're talking about really where he started and what he accomplished, it was a good number of years, from the end of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956 to 1963 and the campaign to integrate Birmingham. So these things can't be done overnight. But assuming that today King would be a leader in an active movement of some sort, and I know you all touched on local issues and subjects that you thought that he would be involved in. Assuming he would be a leader, what kind of movement would he be leading? Would they relate to these areas that you three gentlemen talked about? What kind of movement would he be leading? And where in his career as a peace and justice worker do you think he would be currently? Paulo?
Yeah, I'll answer the You know, I think that after 2011, a year of so much unrest, somebody like Dr. King would be just on the cusp of getting drawn into politics and beyond, you know, serving as a pastor of a congregation. It's becoming clear that we're living through a period of transition in the United States. One chapter of the nation's life is ending, and another is about to begin, and that creates some uncertainty. For example, in terms of the next chapter, our credit rating was downgraded for the first time last summer. It's not clear whether the country will be able to keep some of its financial promises in the near future, and the next generation may not live as well as the current generation. And the current generation doesn't seem to be doing so well. I think a new study came out from Indiana University saying that about 50%, over 50% of citizens in the U.S. are living in or near poverty today. This is at a time when 50% of every dollar spent by the federal government goes to military spending. So I think we haven't seen the kind of courageous act or the desperation just yet, but I think something may happen in 2012 to dramatize the injustices that are contributing to the suffering of large numbers of people, some event that might get the next Martin Luther King involved in politics. I don't think he would be fully committed to any one issue just yet.
I truly think if the Honorable Martin Luther King was with us today, he definitely would be concerned about the family, the black familyhood. You know, Martin Luther King took a very wonderful picture with his son when he came home after they had threatened to kill him. And he was sitting there with his son, and I always give this picture to young children, and I also give it to men, because the Honorable Martin Luther King cared about the welfare of the children. And he knew how important it was for every child and every person to have an equal opportunity to get a quality education. I know if he was here today, he would be down at the school board raising hell with the folks that's called themselves running school. I know if he was here today, he would be down in the halls of the courtrooms and said, why are you practicing so much injustice against people of color? I know he would be at the state attorney's office asking him, why do you put 56% of young black males in prison for nonviolent crimes and charge them as adults? I know he would ask those questions. I know that he would ask the question about the wars, especially the war that we did in Iraq. I know that he would. And if you parallel the times, the same problems when Martin Luther King was living are prevalent today, especially after the Honorable President Obama was elected into office. We see the spills of old Jim Crow coming out in the Tea Party people. And I think Martin Luther King would be standing on Mount Everest, hollering out to Americans, we're not going back to slavery. When he said free at last, he was hoping we all would be free. He was free. But we will be free one day too, when we realize injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
All right, Shahid.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that, I actually think there would not be a new movement. I think it would be a continuation of the movement that he began. It would be the latest iteration. We've not realized the dream fully yet. And so it seems to me that, you know, that he would just have seen a new way of developing further the work he had done. His strides have been made, but there's still such a long way to go. Whatever he did, it would be people-focused. In his speech, A Time to Break Silence, which is a really key speech, I think, because it's one that's very late in his life and career. It was given at Riverside Church in 1967. It was really focused on the Vietnam War and his opposition to it. He said, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. And that speaks today. When machines and computers' profit margins and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. It seems to me he would continue the movement that he began. He also said in the same speech, "We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. But that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will look uneasily at our glaring contrast of poverty and wealth." 1967, it's still true in 2012.
Thank you. Reverend Stokes, if I can continue with you, please, and I'm up to question 5 if you're interrupted. At the end of his life, Dr. King was planning the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. He envisioned poor people from all over the country converging on Washington and campaigning there on the National Mall until economic justice was served. Again, assuming that in this year, 2012, King were the leader of a movement, what kind of event? You know, we're doing things differently, and a lot of times we're doing things very much the same. What kind of event do you think he would be planning to advance peace and justice today?
A march on Washington.
That was simple. Mr. Freeman?
Yes, I think he would be doing something like that, a march on Washington. But I think that he would also be marching throughout the country. You know, I do believe that the Honorable Martin Luther King having lived, he probably would have been our first man of color to be elected as president. I really believe that. Because during his time, no one moved us and brought us together more so than what he did. You know, when I look at Bloody Sunday, and I just want to take a minute to deviate a little bit, but when I look at Bloody Sunday and saw what happened on that day with John Lewis, whom the man I've had the honor of standing with him to talk to, to sit down with him, to hear the struggles, and to, even though I lived and saw it, but to see someone who actually did it in a commercial. And when I see that commercial, when they beat John Lewis and beat him and beat him and beat him along with everybody else, John Lewis got up and he shook himself off with blood splattering everywhere, and he looked at his oppressors and said, "Is that all you got?" Now, for me, I don't know if I could have done that or not, but I remember John, I asked him about that question, and you know what he said to me? He said, "Shaheed, we had a great leader in Martin Luther King. He kept us disciplined. He knew that nonviolence was the best way to go." And when I see people today thinking that violence is the answer, just like what happened down in West Palm Beach just a few days ago, where people reminding us that they will lynch us, putting signs of people being tortured, it tells us that we have a long ways to go. But what I do like about it, more people that don't look like me are standing up against that. And we have to give credit to Martin Luther King for that.
In terms of the event that Dr. King might be working on today, I think he might be working on a way to dramatize the injustice of economic inequality, but in a more constructive way than Occupy Wall Street. Rather than calling on people to occupy public spaces, I think he might try to organize people in a way that would challenge the control of distant multinational corporations over our local economies. For example, he might try to organize a cooperative store that sells local products only. No Chinese products, nothing from Asia at all. Imagine if there were store products just from Palm Beach County. Couldn't we survive that way? I think we could. A local cooperative store would give people an opportunity to earn wealth through their own efforts rather than simply getting more government benefits or taking a job, part-time job. On the flip side of that, Dr. King might be organizing boycotts of multinational chain stores in his community. He spoke a lot about selective buying campaigns as a way to pressure the economic elite and to open their eyes to the injustice of some of their practices. In fact, Operation Breadbasket, a program that he and Jesse Jackson first